She said I was trying to manipulate him. Then he hit the table, and I didn't scream. The silence that followed would change everything I thought I knew about love, family, and the price of blind devotion. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. If you also believe we still have value, even after 60, type 1 in the comments. And please, leave a like and subscribe. Let's show the world we're strong together. My name is Margaret Chen, and at 67, I thought I understood my place in this world. Every morning, I'd wake up in my small apartment in Queens, New York, the same routine carved into my bones like prayer. Coffee first, always coffee, black and bitter, just like the loneliness I'd learned to swallow without complaint. The ceramic mug bore the faded words, "World's Best Grandma," a Mother's Day gift from my grandson Tommy 3 years ago, back when such gestures still felt genuine rather than obligatory. The apartment smelled of lavender fabric softener and the faint aroma of yesterday's dinner, usually something simple, economical, designed to stretch ingredients across multiple meals. My Social Security check didn't allow for extravagance, but I'd learned to find richness in small things. The way morning light filtered through my kitchen window, casting geometric patterns across the worn linoleum floor, or the sound of children playing in the courtyard below, their laughter a bittersweet reminder of the family I'd sacrificed everything to nurture. My daily uniform consisted of comfortable clothes chosen for practicality rather than style. Soft cardigans in muted colors, sensible shoes that wouldn't aggravate the arthritis in my feet, pants with elastic waistbands that accommodated a body shaped by 7 decades of hard work and harder choices. I kept my silver hair neat, always neat, because appearances mattered when you were already invisible to most of the world. At my age, slovenliness felt like surrender, and I wasn't ready to surrender anything else. The walls of my living room displayed a gallery of family photographs spanning 40 years, graduation pictures, wedding photos, baby portraits, holiday gatherings where everyone smiled for the camera while I stood slightly apart. Always the photographer, rarely the subject. In the center hung my most treasured image, Elliot's college graduation, his arm around my shoulders, both of us beaming with pride and possibility. I was 51 then, still young enough to believe that sacrifices would eventually be rewarded, that love given freely would naturally be returned in kind. That Tuesday started like any other, with my morning ritual of checking my phone for messages that rarely came. The silence from my family had become so routine that I'd stopped expecting communication, stopped feeling disappointed when days passed without contact. They were busy, I told myself, important people with important lives, careers that demanded attention, social obligations that filled their calendars with activities that somehow never included me. But today was different. Today my phone buzzed with a text from my daughter-in-law, Meadow. "Family dinner Sunday. Your place. Can you cook for everyone?" The message was brief, practical, devoid of warmth or gratitude, but it sent electricity through my tired body. They wanted to see me. They wanted to gather in my home, to eat food I'd prepared with love, to sit around my table and share the kind of conversation that built memories and strengthened bonds. For the first time in months, I felt necessary, wanted, valued for something beyond my ability to provide financial support or emergency childcare. I texted back immediately, "Of course. What time? How many people?" The response came hours later. 6 o'clock, the usual crowd. The usual crowd meant 8 people. My son Elliot and his wife Meadow, their 2 children Tommy and Emma, Meadow's sister Rachel with her husband Mark, and their teenage daughter Sophie. A full house, a complete family, the kind of gathering I'd dreamed about during the countless lonely evenings when I ate dinner alone while watching game shows that filled the silence without addressing the emptiness. I spent the next 5 days planning that meal with the intensity of a military campaign. Every detail mattered because this dinner represented more than food. It was proof of my value, evidence that I still had something essential to offer, confirmation that the family I'd devoted my life to building still had room for its architect. Shopping became an adventure rather than a chore. I walked through the grocery store aisles with purpose, selecting ingredients with the careful consideration of someone whose budget required strategic choices, but whose heart demanded abundance. Prime rib, because Elliot had mentioned loving it during a phone call 3 months earlier. Fresh asparagus, even though it cost more than I usually spent on vegetables for an entire week. Real vanilla for the cake, not the artificial extract I typically used. Heavy cream for mashed potatoes that would be silky rather than lumpy. My arthritis protested as I carried bags heavier than I should have managed alone, but the anticipation of their faces when they saw the spread I'd prepared made every ache worthwhile. This would be the dinner they remembered. The meal that reminded them how much their grandmother loved them, how much their presence in my life meant to me. Saturday, I cleaned my apartment with the thoroughness of someone preparing for royalty. Every surface gleamed. Every cushion was plumped. Every piece of furniture arranged to maximize seating and conversation flow. I set the table with my good china. The set I'd received as a wedding gift 43 years ago and had used perhaps a dozen times since, saving it for occasions special enough to justify risking chips or breaks. The white porcelain plates bore delicate blue flowers around their edges, a pattern called Eternal Spring that had seemed so hopeful when I'd first unwrapped them as a young bride. Crystal wine glasses caught the light from my dining room fixture, creating tiny rainbows that danced across the tablecloth I'd ironed twice to eliminate every wrinkle. Cloth napkins, not paper, folded into precise triangles beside each place setting. Sunday afternoon, I started cooking at 2 o'clock to ensure everything would be perfect by 6. The prime rib went into the oven with a rub of herbs and garlic that filled my apartment with aromas so rich they seemed to promise happiness. Potatoes boiled and were mashed with cream and butter until they achieved the consistency of clouds. Asparagus waited to be steamed at the last minute, still crisp and bright green. A salad of mixed greens and cherry tomatoes sat dressed and ready in my best serving bowl. The chocolate cake, Tommy's favorite, cooled on a wire rack, its dark layers promising the kind of sweetness that made special occasions memorable. I'd made the frosting from scratch, whipping butter and powdered sugar until it formed peaks that looked professional enough for a bakery display. At 5:30, I changed into my best dress, navy blue with pearl buttons, the one Elliot had complimented 2 Christmases ago when he'd said it made me look distinguished. I applied lipstick and a touch of perfume, wanting to look like someone worth visiting rather than someone they were obligated to see. 6 o'clock arrived with the punctuality of a church bell. The table was set. The food was ready. The apartment gleamed. I waited. 6:15 came and went with no knock on my door, no phone call to explain a delay. I checked my phone obsessively, refreshing text messages and voicemails, certain I'd missed some communication about traffic or last-minute complications. By 6:30, the asparagus had grown cold in its steamer. The prime rib rested under foil, still warm, but losing the perfect temperature that made meat memorable rather than merely edible. 7 o'clock brought a silence so complete it seemed to have weight, pressing down on my chest like a physical force. I sat at the head of my beautifully set table, still dressed in my good clothes, still hoping that any moment I'd hear footsteps in the hallway outside my door. At 7:30, I served myself a single plate from the feast I'd prepared for 8. The food tasted like disappointment, each bite a reminder of expectations that had apparently been mine alone. The prime rib was perfectly cooked, the potatoes creamy and rich, the asparagus tender but not mushy. Everything exactly as I'd planned, exactly as they would have loved it if they'd bothered to show up. By 8 o'clock, I'd accepted that no one was coming. The beautiful meal I'd spent days planning and hours preparing would feed me for a week, each leftover portion a monument to my foolishness in believing that love given freely would be valued by those who received it. The silence in my apartment felt different now, not the comfortable quiet of solitude, but the crushing weight of abandonment. I cleared the table mechanically, wrapping food in containers, washing dishes that had held my hopes along with the ingredients I'd so carefully prepared. As I stood at my kitchen sink, elbow deep in soapy water, my phone finally buzzed with a message. It was from Meadow. Sorry, change of plans, family emergency, rain check, family emergency. The words should have brought concern, but instead they brought a different kind of pain. What emergency had required the participation of everyone except me? What crisis had been serious enough to cancel our dinner, but not serious enough to warrant a phone call asking for my help or support? I dried my hands on a dish towel embroidered with cheerful sunflowers, another gift from a grandchild who apparently couldn't be bothered to spend an evening in my company, and typed back a response that took me 20 minutes to compose. Of course. I hope everyone is okay. Let me know if you need anything. The response was everything I'd been taught to be: understanding, supportive, selfless. It was also a lie. I wasn't understanding. I was devastated. I wasn't supportive. I was angry. And I was tired, so very tired, of being selfless when no one else seemed capable of returning even the smallest portion of the consideration I consistently offered them. That night, I lay in bed surrounded by the lingering aromas of a meal no one had shared, staring at the ceiling while my mind replayed every detail of the preparation, every moment of anticipation, every hour I'd spent believing that this time would be different. Tomorrow I would wake up and pretend that tonight hadn't broken something fundamental inside me. I would continue to be the grandmother who never complained, never demanded, never expressed disappointment when disappointment was all I felt. But something had shifted in the darkness of my bedroom. Something I couldn't yet name but could feel growing like a seed that had finally found the right conditions to sprout. The woman who had given everything to everyone was about to discover what happened when giving everything left you with nothing, not even the dignity of being remembered when dinner was served. The next morning brought no apology calls, no explanations, no acknowledgement that anything significant had happened. I woke to the same silence that had consumed my apartment the night before, but now it felt heavier, more intentional. The leftover prime rib sat in my refrigerator like evidence of my own delusion, each container a reminder of how thoroughly I'd misjudged my importance to the people I loved most. I made my coffee and sat at my kitchen table, staring at the spot where Elliot should have been sitting, where Tommy should have been telling me about school, where Emma should have been showing me her latest drawing. Instead, I faced an empty chair, and the growing realization that this wasn't the first time I'd been forgotten. It was simply the first time I'd allowed myself to feel the full weight of the abandonment. My mind drifted back to the beginning, to the foundation of sacrifices that had built this family I was apparently no longer essential to maintaining. 42 years ago, I was Margaret Santos, a 25-year-old nurse working night shifts at Mount Sinai Hospital in Manhattan. I lived in a tiny studio apartment in the Bronx, taking the subway to work through neighborhoods that grew progressively safer as I moved closer to the Upper East Side where my patients lived lives I could barely imagine. My uniform was always crisp, my shoes always polished, my hair pulled back in the neat bun that hospital regulations required, and that made me feel professional, competent, worthy of the trust patients placed in me when they were at their most vulnerable. I met Robert Chen during one of those night shifts, when he arrived in the emergency room with a construction injury that required 12 stitches and a tetanus shot. He was handsome in the way that made my hands shake when I cleaned his wound, with dark eyes that seemed to see something in me that I hadn't known existed. He asked me to dinner before the bandages were dry, and I said yes with the breathless excitement of someone who'd spent too many evenings alone, eating takeout while studying for nursing certifications I hoped would eventually lead to better shifts and higher pay. Our courtship was brief but intense. Robert worked in construction, building the skyscrapers that were transforming Manhattan's skyline, and he spoke about the future with the confidence of someone who believed hard work would inevitably be rewarded. He wanted a wife, children, a house in the suburbs where his kids could play in yards instead of concrete playgrounds. I wanted to be wanted, to build something permanent with someone who looked at me like I was the answer to questions he'd been asking his whole life. We married 6 months after meeting, in a small ceremony at St. Mary's Catholic Church in the Bronx. My wedding dress was simple white cotton that I'd bought on sale and altered myself, and Robert wore his only suit, navy blue with a tie his mother had given him for job interviews. The reception was in the church basement, with folding tables covered in paper tablecloths and a cake my aunt had baked as her gift to us. It wasn't elegant, but it was ours. And when Robert spun me around that cramped dance floor to music from a borrowed radio, I felt like the luckiest woman in New York. Elliot was born 2 years later, during a blizzard that shut down half the city and kept Robert from reaching the hospital until after our son had already arrived. I labored for 14 hours with only the nurses and a resident doctor who looked younger than my baby brother. But when I finally held Elliot in my arms, his tiny fist wrapped around my finger with surprising strength, I understood what people meant when they talked about love that changed everything. Robert held his son with the reverence of someone handling something precious beyond measure. "He's going to have everything we didn't," he whispered, and I believed him completely. We would sacrifice whatever necessary to ensure Elliot's future would be brighter than our past, that he would have opportunities we'd never imagined, that our love would be sufficient to protect him from the disappointments and struggles we'd endured. When Elliot was 3 years old, Robert's construction company went bankrupt. The boss disappeared overnight, taking the pension fund and leaving 37 families without paychecks or benefits. Robert spent weeks looking for comparable work, but the economy was in recession, and construction jobs were scarce. He took temporary work where he could find it, loading trucks, painting houses, anything that paid enough to keep us afloat while he searched for something permanent. I increased my hours at the hospital, working double shifts whenever possible, leaving Elliot with my neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez, who charged me less than professional childcare because she understood what it meant to stretch every dollar until it screamed. Some nights, I worked 18 hours straight, catching naps in hospital break rooms between patients, surviving on coffee and the kind of determination that comes from having someone small and defenseless depending on your ability to provide. Those were the months when I learned to sleep standing up, to eat meals in 5-minute increments between emergencies, to smile at patients and colleagues while my body ached with exhaustion so profound it felt like illness. But every paycheck brought us closer to stability. Every overtime hour meant Elliot could keep his nice clothes and his books, and his sense that the world was secure enough to trust. When Robert finally found steady work again, with a smaller company that paid less but offered benefits, I thought our struggles were temporary setbacks that would make our eventual success more meaningful. We moved to a better apartment in Queens, with 2 bedrooms and a kitchen large enough for a real table, where we could eat dinner together like a proper family. But Robert had changed during those months of unemployment. The confidence that had first attracted me had been replaced by a restless anxiety that no amount of steady work seemed able to calm. He started going out after work, stopping at bars with friends who were also struggling, staying out later and later while I sat at home with Elliot, helping with homework and reading bedtime stories and pretending I didn't notice the smell of alcohol when Robert finally stumbled through our front door. The drinking became routine, then problematic, then destructive. Robert would promise to come home for dinner and arrive at midnight. He would swear he'd attend Elliot's school events and forget completely, leaving me to make excuses to our 7-year-old son about why Daddy couldn't make it to the science fair or the school play. I covered for him constantly, protecting Elliot from the knowledge that his father was choosing alcohol over family, that the man we both loved was slowly disappearing into a bottle that seemed to matter more than anything we could offer. I worked extra shifts to compensate for the money Robert spent in bars, saving every possible penny for Elliot's future, while pretending our present wasn't falling apart one broken promise at a time. The morning Robert left, Elliot was 9 years old. I woke up to find a note on the kitchen table, written in handwriting I barely recognized as my husband's. "I can't do this anymore. Take care of Elliot. I'm sorry." That was it. 11 years of marriage, reduced to 3 sentences that didn't even have the courtesy to mention love or regret or any acknowledgement of what he was destroying by walking away. His clothes were gone from our bedroom closet. His tools had vanished from the garage. Even his coffee mug, the one that said "World's Greatest Dad," had disappeared, as if he'd needed to erase every trace of the man he'd pretended to be. Elliot cried for 3 days straight, not the dramatic sobbing of a child throwing a tantrum, but the quiet, steady tears of someone who'd been taught that the world was safe, and had suddenly discovered that safety was an illusion adults created to protect children from truths too harsh for small hearts to bear. I held him while he cried, stroking his hair and whispering promises I had no idea how to keep. "We'll be okay," I told him. "We have each other, and that's enough. We're going to be fine." But I wasn't fine. I was 27 years old, suddenly single, working as many hours as the hospital would allow while trying to raise a heartbroken child who kept asking when Daddy was coming home. The answer, never, was too cruel to speak aloud. So I learned to deflect and distract, to turn conversations toward the future rather than dwelling on the abandonment that had redefined our present. From that moment forward, every decision I made was filtered through one question: what was best for Elliot? My own needs became secondary, then invisible, then forgotten entirely. I worked nights so I could be available during his school days. I skipped social events to attend his baseball games and school concerts. I bought him name-brand clothes while wearing discount store basics, ensuring he never felt different from his classmates whose families had more resources. When Elliot was accepted to NYU with a partial scholarship, I was so proud I cried in the financial aid office. The partial scholarship covered tuition, but living expenses, books, and everything else would cost nearly $15,000 a year. Money I didn't have but would find somehow, because this was Elliot's chance to build the future Robert and I had dreamed of giving him. I took a second job, working weekends at a private clinic in Manhattan where wealthy patients paid premium prices for personalized care. The work was less demanding than the hospital, but it meant I worked 7 days a week, sleeping 4 hours a night, surviving on coffee, and the knowledge that every dollar I earned brought Elliot closer to graduation and the career that would justify all the sacrifices I was making. During those 4 years, I lived like a monk, spending money only on absolute necessities, eating cereal for dinner more often than I care to remember, wearing the same 3 outfits to work in rotation because buying new clothes felt like stealing from Elliot's education fund. I didn't date, didn't socialize, didn't do anything that might take time or money away from the singular focus of launching my son into adulthood with the tools he needed to succeed. The day Elliot graduated from college, walking across that stage in his cap and gown to receive his diploma in business administration, I sat in the audience and felt like I could finally breathe. We'd done it. Despite Robert's abandonment, despite the financial struggles, despite the exhaustion and sacrifice and lonely nights when I'd wondered if I was strong enough to continue, we'd done it. Elliot was educated, confident, ready to build the life I'd worked myself into early arthritis to make possible. And for the first time in 18 years, I allowed myself to imagine what I might do with my life now that his future was secure. That hope lasted exactly 3 months. "Mom, I met someone," Elliot announced during one of our weekly dinners at the diner near his new apartment in Brooklyn. "Her name is Meadow, and I think she might be the one." I smiled and asked the questions mothers ask. How did they meet? What did she do for work? When would I get to meet her? But something in Elliot's tone made me nervous, a defensiveness that suggested he was protecting this relationship from my judgment rather than sharing his happiness with someone who loved him. When I finally met Meadow, 6 weeks later, my instincts proved accurate. She was beautiful in the calculated way that required significant time and money to maintain. With salon-perfect hair and clothes that cost more than I spent on groceries in a month, she spoke about Elliot's potential and their future together, with the confidence of someone who'd already decided how his life should unfold. "Elliot tells me you're a nurse," she said during that first dinner. Her tone suggesting nursing was slightly more respectable than unemployment, but significantly less impressive than the careers her friends' mothers-in-law had chosen. "I've been a nurse for 23 years, I replied, trying to match her smile. "How stable," she said, and I knew immediately that this woman saw me as an obstacle to overcome rather than a family member to embrace. But Elliot was in love, and I'd learned long ago that young men in love don't welcome maternal skepticism about their chosen partners. So I smiled and asked appropriate questions and pretended not to notice the way Meadow evaluated my apartment, my clothes, my life choices with the calculating gaze of someone assessing assets and liabilities. 6 months later, they announced their engagement. The wedding would be small, they explained. Just immediate family and close friends. But when the guest list arrived, I discovered that immediate family apparently didn't include me. "There was a miscommunication," Elliot explained when I called to ask about my invitation. "Meadow's family is larger than we expected, and the venue has limited capacity. We thought you'd understand." I did understand. I understood that the woman my son loved had determined I wasn't important enough to witness the most significant moment of his adult life. I understood that all the sacrifices I'd made, all the love I'd given, all the years I'd devoted to ensuring his happiness had earned me exactly nothing in return. But I said, "Of course I understand, sweetheart. I'm happy for you both, because that's what mothers do. We understand." We smile. We pretend our hearts aren't breaking while our children choose other people to love them. Was I used? The question had been whispering in my mind for months, growing louder each time Elliot canceled our dinner plans because Meadow needed him, each time he forgot my birthday because they were busy with her family's celebrations, each time he asked for my help but forgot to ask about my life. Was I used? Sitting in my kitchen that morning, surrounded by the evidence of a dinner no one had bothered to attend, I finally allowed myself to consider the possibility that the answer might be yes. The days following the missed dinner blurred together in a haze of forced normalcy. I went through my routines, grocery shopping with a list shortened by financial reality, watching morning shows that promised solutions to problems I couldn't afford to solve, calling Elliot and leaving voicemails that went unreturned for days. But underneath the surface of ordinary activities, something was shifting, like tectonic plates moving deep beneath familiar ground. It started with small observations I'd trained myself to ignore. The way Meadow's eyes glazed over whenever I spoke, as if my words were background noise she had to endure rather than conversation she might value. The manner in which she redirected every story I told about Elliot's childhood, as if his life had begun the day he met her, and everything before was irrelevant prehistory. "Oh, Elliot was such a good student," I'd say during one of our rare family gatherings, sharing pride in achievements I'd sacrificed to make possible. "He's so much more focused now," Meadow would respond, the implication clear. Whatever success Elliot had achieved under my guidance was nothing compared to the improvements she'd inspired. These moments accumulated like drops of water wearing away stone, each one small enough to dismiss individually but collectively creating an erosion of my place in my own son's narrative. I began to notice how conversations shifted when I entered rooms, how laughter died when I approached groups at family functions, how my contributions to discussions were met with polite smiles that never reached anyone's eyes. The grandchildren became weapons of subtle warfare, though they were too young to understand their role in their mother's campaign. Tommy, now 8, had been my constant companion during weekend visits, eager to hear stories about his father's childhood and help me bake cookies that we'd eat while watching cartoons. But those visits became increasingly rare, canceled at the last minute with explanations that felt more like excuses. "Tommy has a play date," Meadow would text, minutes before he was supposed to arrive. "Maybe next weekend." Next weekend would bring another excuse. Birthday parties I wasn't invited to, family activities that somehow didn't include family, sudden illnesses that seemed to coincide perfectly with our scheduled time together. Emma, still only 5, was too young to understand why Grandma's house visits had become infrequent, but old enough to ask questions that cut through my heart like surgical instruments. "Why don't you come to my school plays anymore, Grandma? Why aren't you in our family pictures? Did we make you sad?" Each question required lies wrapped in reassurance, explanations that protected their innocence while slowly killing something essential inside me. I became complicit in my own erasure, helping to maintain the fiction that everything was normal while my role in their lives diminished from essential to optional to nearly invisible. The financial requests began subtly, woven into conversations about their expanding lifestyle and increasing expenses. Meadow had convinced Elliot that they needed a house in a better neighborhood, closer to the private schools where Tommy and Emma would receive the education their potential deserved. The down payment was substantial, the mortgage payments would stretch their budget, but it was an investment in the children's future. "We're just a little short on the closing costs," Elliot explained during one of our coffee meetings, his voice carrying the practiced casualness of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. "I know you don't have much, Mom, but even a couple thousand would help us get into this house. Think about what it would mean for Tommy and Emma. A couple thousand. Nearly half my annual savings, accumulated through years of choosing generic medications over name brands, walking to work instead of taking buses, eating canned soup for dinner so I could save money for emergencies that never seemed to come. But it was for the grandchildren, for their education, their opportunities, their chance to grow up in the kind of neighborhood where success felt natural rather than miraculous. How could I say no to investments in their future when I'd spent my entire adult life making similar sacrifices? I wrote the check that afternoon, watching my savings account balance drop to numbers that would have terrified me if I'd allowed myself to think about retirement or medical emergencies or any of the financial disasters that could devastate someone living on Social Security and occasional nursing shifts. The house was beautiful. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a backyard where the children could play safely while Meadow supervised from the kitchen window. When they invited me for the housewarming party, I felt proud of my contribution to their happiness, grateful to have played a role in providing this stability for my family. But at the party, when neighbors asked how they'd managed to afford such a lovely home, Meadow smiled and credited careful financial planning and smart budgeting. My contribution was never mentioned, as if the money had materialized through their own wisdom rather than my willingness to sacrifice financial security for their dreams. I stood in their beautiful living room, surrounded by guests who admired the hardwood floors and updated kitchen that my money had helped purchase, listening to my daughter-in-law accept compliments for achievements she couldn't have reached without my help. The invisibility felt physical, like standing in sunlight but casting no shadow. The pattern repeated with smaller requests that followed the same script: emergencies that required immediate assistance, opportunities that would slip away without quick action, investments in the children's futures that only a selfish grandmother would refuse to support, 1,000 for car repairs when their vehicle broke down, 500 for Emma's dance classes at the exclusive studio where other children from good families learned discipline and grace, 700 for Tommy's baseball equipment and tournament fees. Each request came with emotional leverage carefully calibrated to make refusal feel like betrayal. How could I prioritize my own financial security over Tommy's chance to play with the travel team? What kind of grandmother would let Emma miss out on dance lessons that could teach her confidence and poise? Didn't I want them to have opportunities I'd never been able to provide for Elliot? The requests were always loans, of course, money they fully intended to repay as soon as Elliot's next promotion came through, or Meadow's freelance design business took off, or their tax refund arrived. But the repayments never materialized, and bringing up the subject felt petty, small-minded, evidence of the kind of penny-pinching mentality that kept people from achieving real success. My 67th birthday passed without acknowledgement. Not a card, not a phone call, not even a text message to mark the anniversary of my birth. I waited all day, checking my phone obsessively, certain that someone would remember, that some gesture would arrive to prove I hadn't been completely forgotten by the people I loved most. That evening, I called Elliot myself. "Happy birthday to me," I said when he answered, trying to keep my voice light, casual, as if the oversight were amusing rather than devastating. "Oh God, Mom, I'm so sorry. Things have been crazy with work, and Meadow's been dealing with Emma's school situation, and I feel terrible. Can we take you to dinner this weekend? Make it up to you?" The dinner never happened. Something always came up. Tommy got sick, Meadow's mother visited unexpectedly, work deadlines couldn't be postponed. The promises felt genuine when they were made, but proved as substantial as morning mist when weekend arrived. I began to understand that I existed in their lives as a resource rather than a relationship, someone who could be activated when needs arose but otherwise remained safely distant, available but not intrusive, helpful but not demanding. The realization didn't arrive as a dramatic revelation, but as a slow accumulation of evidence that finally reached critical mass. The turning point came during what should have been a moment of celebration. Tommy's school was having a Grandparents' Day, an annual event where children presented projects about their family history and shared special time with their grandparents. Tommy had been working on a presentation about our family, gathering photos and stories that spanned 3 generations. I spent weeks helping him prepare, sharing memories about his grandfather Robert and his great-grandparents, teaching him about our family's immigration story and the struggles that had shaped our values. We created a poster board filled with photographs and handwritten stories, a visual narrative that connected his young life to the sacrifices and dreams of relatives he'd never met. The night before the presentation, Meadow called. "I'm so sorry, Margaret, but we've decided Tommy shouldn't participate in Grandparents' Day this year. It's just, the other children's grandparents are very accomplished people, and we don't want Tommy to feel embarrassed." Embarrassed. By me. By the nurse who'd worked 2 jobs to put his father through college, who'd sacrificed financial security to help buy their house, who'd spent countless hours helping with homework and bedtime stories, and all the small acts of love that built childhood memories. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "Tommy and I have been working on his presentation for weeks. He's excited about sharing our family history." "It's not about the presentation," Meadow replied, her tone suggesting she was explaining something obvious to someone deliberately obtuse. "It's about appearances. The other grandparents are doctors and lawyers and business owners. You're a nurse. And your apartment isn't exactly impressive if any of them ask about your living situation." The words hit like physical blows, each one precisely aimed at insecurities I'd spent decades trying to overcome. My profession, the work that had supported my family through every crisis, that had provided meaning and purpose beyond mere survival, reduced to something shameful that might embarrass my grandson. My modest apartment, the home I'd maintained through careful budgeting and pride in simple things, transformed into evidence of failure rather than stability. "Tommy wants me there," I said, though my voice was beginning to crack. "Tommy is 8 years old. He doesn't understand how these social dynamics work. As his parents, we have to make decisions that protect his future, even if they're difficult in the moment." The conversation ended with polite promises to schedule a private celebration later. Just the 4 of us, where Tommy could share his presentation without the pressure of public judgment. But I knew, with the certainty that comes from pattern recognition, that the private celebration would never happen. There would be excuses, delays, cancellations, and eventually the topic would fade from everyone's memory, except mine. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the poster board Tommy and I had created together. Our family's story spread across colored paper and photographs, 3 generations of struggle and achievement that Meadow had deemed insufficient for public viewing. The immigrant great-grandparents who'd built lives from nothing. The single mother who'd sacrificed everything for her son's education. The grandmother who'd given financial security to help provide stability for her grandchildren. All of it reduced to embarrassment. All of it deemed unworthy of acknowledgement. I carefully rolled up the poster board and put it in my closet, next to boxes of photo albums and mementos that documented a life Meadow apparently found shameful. As I closed the closet door, I caught my reflection in the bedroom mirror, a 67-year-old woman in a discount store nightgown, her silver hair neat but unremarkable, her face lined with years of work and worry and unconditional love that had somehow become a liability rather than an asset. For the first time in my adult life, I allowed myself to feel angry. Not disappointed, not hurt, not confused. Angry. Pure, clean, uncomplicated rage at the systematic dismissal of everything I'd given, everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd been. The anger felt dangerous and unfamiliar, like handling electrical wiring without proper training. But it also felt clarifying, burning away the fog of self-doubt and endless accommodation that had obscured my vision for so long. Was I used? Yes. The answer arrived with the finality of a diagnosis, settling into my consciousness with the weight of absolute truth. I had been used, consistently and systematically, by people who'd learned that love given freely could be taken for granted, that sacrifice offered without conditions could be exploited without consequences. But acknowledging the truth was only the beginning. The question now was what I intended to do about it. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I picked up my phone and, for the first time in memory, didn't call to apologize or explain or ask what I could do to help. Instead, I began researching, learning, planning, because if I had been used, it was time to stop being useful. The research began at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday night, When sleep eluded me for the third consecutive evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, an old model I'd bought secondhand when the library's computer time limits became insufficient for job applications, and typed words I'd never thought to search before: financial elder abuse, emotional manipulation tactics, setting boundaries with adult children. The results filled my screen with articles that could have been written about my own life, stories of elderly parents drained financially by children who confused love with obligation. Descriptions of manipulation techniques that felt like reading my own diary written by strangers who'd somehow witnessed every conversation I'd had with Meadow over the past 5 years. One article particularly resonated: The Guilt Gift Cycle: How Emotional Manipulators Use Family Bonds to Exploit Resources. The author described a pattern I recognized with devastating clarity: requests framed as emergencies, emotional leverage that made refusal feel like betrayal, gratitude that lasted only until the next crisis arose. Emotional manipulators often isolate their targets from support systems, the article explained, making the victim feel responsible for maintaining family harmony while gradually removing their voice from family decisions. I thought about Grandparents' Day, about my missing invitation to Elliot's wedding, about the housewarming party where my financial contribution was never acknowledged. Each memory now carried new weight, evidence of a systematic campaign I'd been too loving, too blind, to recognize. The laptop screen cast blue light across newspaper clippings I'd never thrown away. Elliot's college graduation announcement, his engagement notice, articles about his promotions that I'd collected with the pride of a mother who'd sacrificed everything to make those achievements possible. Looking at them now, I realized none of those articles mentioned me. Even Elliot's college graduation piece credited his determination and hard work, without acknowledging the double shifts that had paid his tuition or the woman who'd worked herself into arthritis to fund his future. I was erased from my own son's success story. By dawn, I'd filled 3 pages of a notebook with information that felt like evidence in a case I was building against myself. Warning signs I'd ignored, red flags I'd rationalized, moments when I should have questioned whether love was supposed to be so consistently one-sided. At 7:15 a.m., my phone rang. Elliot's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, my heart performed its usual leap of hope. Maybe he was calling to apologize for the missed dinner. Maybe he'd finally realized how his wife was treating me. Maybe this would be the conversation that restored my faith in the family I'd spent my life building. "Mom, hey, quick question." His voice carried the brisk efficiency he used for business calls, not the warmth I remembered from childhood when he'd call me from college, just to hear a familiar voice. "Meadow needs someone to watch the kids this Friday night. Her sister's having a dinner party and the babysitter canceled last minute. Could you do us this favor?" A favor. Watching my own grandchildren had become a favor I performed for them rather than time I treasured for myself. "What time?" I asked, already mentally rearranging my Friday evening plans, which consisted of nothing more exciting than a TV movie and early bedtime, but felt precious because they were mine, chosen freely rather than dictated by other people's needs. 6 to midnight. Maybe a little later if the party runs long. You know how these things go. I didn't know how these things went. I'd never been invited to any of Meadow's sisters' parties, never included in the social circle that apparently required childcare assistance, but not my actual presence. "I'll be there," I said, because saying yes was a reflex I'd developed over decades of putting everyone else's needs before my own. "Great. Thanks, Mom. You're a lifesaver." The line went dead before I could ask about homework schedules or bedtime routines or any of the details that might suggest my role as grandmother involved more than just emergency childcare services. Friday arrived with the kind of October weather that made New York feel almost magical. Crisp air, brilliant sunshine, leaves beginning their annual transformation into the colors that made tourists believe in autumn romance. I walked to Elliot's house through neighborhoods where families were decorating for Halloween, children's laughter drifting from backyards where parents pushed swings and caught footballs and participated in the kind of ordinary moments that built lifelong memories. The house I'd helped them buy looked picture-perfect in the golden afternoon light. Meadow's garden showed the careful attention of someone who had time and money to invest in aesthetic details. Late-blooming mums, decorative pumpkins, a wreath that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. The driveway held two cars, Elliot's practical sedan and Meadow's SUV, both models that suggested financial stability I'd helped make possible. I used my key, a privilege I was grateful to still possess, and found chaos barely contained within beautifully decorated rooms. Tommy sat at the kitchen island, homework spread across granite countertops while simultaneously playing a video game on his tablet. Emma wandered through the living room in a dance costume, practicing moves that sent her spinning dangerously close to furniture that looked expensive and fragile. "Grandma!" Emma launched herself at my legs with the enthusiastic affection that made every babysitting request feel worthwhile. "Watch me dance." I learned a new routine. For the next 20 minutes, I existed in the kind of present-moment joy that reminded me why family mattered. Emma performed her dance with 6-year-old seriousness, narrating each move with explanations about technique and timing that she'd absorbed from classes I'd helped pay for. Tommy eventually abandoned his homework to show me progress on a school project about the solar system. His enthusiasm infectious as he described planetary orbits with the confidence of someone who might grow up to be an astronaut. These moments, pure, uncomplicated connection with children who loved me simply because I was their grandmother, felt like islands of meaning in an ocean of confusion about my place in their parents' lives. At 5:45, Meadow appeared at the top of the stairs, transformed from the casual mother I'd greeted into someone ready for an evening among people who mattered. Her dress was simple but elegant, the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted about its cost. Her jewelry caught the light in ways that suggested real metals rather than costume accessories. "Margaret, thank you so much for doing this," she said, descending the stairs with practiced grace. "The kids have already eaten, so you just need to make sure homework gets done and lights out by 8:30 for Emma, 9 for Tommy." Of course. I'd been watching these children since they were babies. Their routines were as familiar to me as my own, but Meadow always provided instructions as if I were a hired babysitter rather than their grandmother. "Oh, and there's leftover Chinese food in the fridge if you get hungry. Help yourself." Leftover Chinese food. While she attended a dinner party that required professional-level styling and jewelry that reflected light like tiny stars, I was invited to eat reheated takeout in a kitchen I'd helped her afford. Elliot appeared moments later, adjusting cufflinks that were probably gifts from his wife, part of the image management that seemed to consume increasing amounts of their attention and resources. He looked handsome, successful, like someone whose mother should have been proud of the man her sacrifices had helped create. "Hey, Mom. Thanks again. We really appreciate this." He kissed my cheek with the efficient affection of someone checking a task off a list, then gathered keys and wallet and the various accessories that successful people apparently needed for an evening out. "Have fun," I said, meaning it. Despite everything, I wanted Elliot to be happy. The problem wasn't his happiness. It was my growing suspicion that my unhappiness had become a necessary component of maintaining his comfort. They left in a cloud of perfume and optimism, their voices fading as they discussed dinner party logistics and people I'd never meet. I stood at the window and watched their headlights disappear down the street, heading toward an evening that didn't include me, but was made possible by my willingness to provide free childcare. The next 3 hours passed in domestic contentment. Homework was completed with minimal resistance. Dinner was cleaned up. Baths were supervised. And bedtime stories were read with the dramatic voices that made familiar books feel like live theater. Emma fell asleep holding my hand, her small fingers warm and trusting in ways that reminded me why love didn't always require reciprocity to feel meaningful. Tommy stayed awake longer, asking questions about my childhood that suggested a genuine curiosity about family history that his parents seemed eager to minimize. I told him stories about his grandfather Robert, carefully editing out the alcoholism and abandonment while preserving the good memories that deserved to be passed down to another generation. "Dad never talks about Grandpa Robert," Tommy observed with the directness that made 8-year-olds excellent investigators of adult inconsistencies. "Sometimes grown-ups prefer to focus on the present instead of the past," I explained, though I was beginning to wonder if forgetting the past made it easier to repeat old mistakes. By 9:30, both children were asleep, and I settled into the living room with a cup of tea, surrounded by evidence of a life I'd helped create but wasn't truly part of. Family photos covered the mantelpiece and side tables, professional portraits and candid shots that documented holidays and milestones, and ordinary moments that looked precious when frozen in silver frames. I moved through the gallery like a visitor in a museum, studying faces and trying to understand the story these images told about family relationships and hierarchy. Elliot and Meadow appeared in dozens of photos, sometimes with the children, sometimes with her extended family, sometimes with friends whose names I didn't know and faces I'd never seen except in these carefully curated displays. I appeared in exactly 3 photographs. One from last Christmas, standing slightly apart from the main group, my smile looking strained even in the holiday lighting. One from Emma's birthday party 2 years ago, captured in the background while the real celebration happened in the foreground. And one family portrait from Tommy's first communion, where I'd been positioned at the edge of the frame like an afterthought someone had remembered to include at the last moment. 3 photos out of dozens. 3 acknowledgments of my existence in a visual narrative that spanned years of family history. The realization hit me with physical force, doubling me over on their expensive couch as I finally understood how completely I'd been erased from the story they told about themselves. Not just excluded from events, but systematically removed from the evidence that those events had ever happened. At 11:47 p.m., headlights swept across the living room windows. I heard car doors slam, voices carry across the quiet street, the sound of high heels clicking against the driveway. They were home earlier than expected, probably because the party had been less entertaining than anticipated, or because responsible parents didn't stay out past midnight when they had children and babysitters to consider. I moved to the kitchen and began gathering my things. Purse, jacket, the book I'd brought but hadn't had time to read. They would want to discuss the evening briefly, thank me for my help, and send me home to my empty apartment where no one would ask about my day or express interest in my thoughts about anything more significant than weather and television schedules. The front door opened with a burst of cool air, an animated conversation that stopped abruptly when they saw me standing in their kitchen. "Mom, how are the kids?" Elliot's voice carried the forced enthusiasm of someone who'd forgotten to ask a question that should have been his first concern. "Perfect. Homework done, bedtime stories read, everyone asleep by 9:30. Great, thanks again for doing this." Meadow appeared beside him, her perfect evening slightly disheveled but her makeup still intact, suggesting an event that had been enjoyable but not transcendent. "How was the party?" I asked, because polite people inquired about each other's experiences, even when they weren't invited to share them. "Lovely," Meadow replied. Rachel outdid herself with the decorations. The whole house looked like something from a magazine. She described centerpieces and menu items and conversations with people whose names meant nothing to me, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd spent the evening among peers who appreciated her contributions to discussions about topics I would never understand. "Well, I should head home," I said, moving toward the door with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned not to overstay her welcome in her own son's house. "Wait, Mom." Elliot's voice stopped me at the threshold. "Before you go, there's something we need to discuss." Something in his tone made me turn around, my hand still on the doorknob, my body positioned for escape that suddenly felt necessary rather than polite. "We've been talking," he continued, "and we think it would be better if you didn't watch the kids anymore." The words hit like cold water, shocking and disorienting. "What do you mean?" Meadow stepped forward with the practiced grace of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. "We've decided to hire a professional nanny, someone with credentials and experience with children from good families. Children from good families. As if my family, the family that had produced the man she'd married, wasn't good enough for the children I'd helped support since birth. "I don't understand," I said, though understanding was already forming like ice in my chest. "It's nothing personal," Elliot added quickly. "It's just that the kids are getting older, and they need more structured care. Educational activities, language instruction, that kind of thing. I could learn," I said, hearing the desperation in my voice and hating it. "I could take classes, read books, whatever you think they need." The silence that followed felt heavier than words. Elliot and Meadow exchanged glances that communicated entire conversations I wasn't invited to join. "It's already decided," Meadow said with finality that left no room for negotiation. "We appreciate everything you've done, but it's time for us to move in a different direction. Different direction. Away from me. Away from the grandmother who'd sacrificed financial security to help buy their house, who'd provided free childcare for years, who'd loved their children with the fierce devotion that only grandparents could offer." I walked to my car in silence, my legs moving automatically while my mind struggled to process what had just happened. They were firing me from my role as grandmother, terminating my relationship with Tommy and Emma as efficiently as they might dismiss an employee who'd outlived her usefulness. The drive home passed in a blur of streetlights and stop signs that I navigated through muscle memory rather than conscious attention. My apartment felt smaller when I arrived, the silence more profound, the future more uncertain than it had ever seemed before. I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the phone, considering who I might call to discuss this devastating development. But the contacts in my phone were limited to doctors, utility companies, and the family members who'd just severed my most important connection to meaning and purpose. For the first time in my adult life, I had no one to call, no one who would understand, no one who would care that my heart was breaking in ways I didn't have words to describe. But as I sat there in the silence, something unexpected began to grow alongside the grief. Not acceptance. I wasn't ready for that yet. But clarity. Cold, sharp recognition of exactly what I was dealing with and what needed to change. They thought they could discard me like a worn-out appliance that had served its purpose. They were about to discover how wrong they were. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of autumn sunshine that made promises about better days ahead. I woke at 6:30 a.m., the same time I'd been rising for 40 years, but instead of the familiar weight of obligations pressing down on my chest, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: complete freedom to choose how I spent my day. No phone calls to make checking on grandchildren I was no longer allowed to see. No emergency babysitting requests to accommodate. No guilt about spending money on myself instead of saving it for the next family crisis that would require my financial intervention. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, watching the morning light transform my modest apartment from a place I'd been ashamed of into a sanctuary that belonged entirely to me. The mismatched furniture I'd collected over years of careful budgeting suddenly looked eclectic rather than poor. The photographs on my walls, mostly images of people who'd stopped including me in their lives, seemed like evidence of time I'd wasted rather than love I'd given. The silence felt different too. Not the oppressive quiet of loneliness, but the peaceful hush of possibility. For the first time in memory, no one needed anything from me. No one expected me to solve their problems, fund their dreams, or sacrifice my comfort for their convenience. At 9:15 a.m., I did something I hadn't done in 5 years. I got dressed without considering who I might see or what impression I needed to make. I chose clothes for their comfort rather than their appropriateness, selecting a soft purple sweater Elliot had once said made me look old, and jeans that fit properly instead of the looser styles Meadow had suggested would be more flattering for my age. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and saw a 67-year-old woman who'd spent so many years trying to make herself acceptable to other people that she'd forgotten what she actually looked like when she pleased only herself. The face staring back at me was lined but not defeated, tired but not broken, older but not invisible. My first stop was the bank, where I'd maintained accounts for 30 years, but had never made any decisions more complicated than depositing paychecks and paying bills. The building felt imposing as I walked through glass doors that reflected my image back at me. A small, silver-haired woman who looked like she might need help rather than someone with business to conduct. "I'd like to speak with someone about my accounts," I told the receptionist, a young woman whose polished appearance suggested she was accustomed to dealing with clients whose financial situations were more impressive than mine. "Of course. What type of assistance do you need today?" "I want to close some accounts and restructure others." The words felt foreign in my mouth, like speaking a language I'd studied but never practiced. But they also felt powerful, declarative, like taking control of something that had been managed by other people's expectations for too long. 20 minutes later, I sat across from Linda Vasquez, a financial advisor whose patient demeanor suggested she'd guided many people through decisions they'd been avoiding for years. She reviewed my account history with the kind of professional attention that made me feel like a valued client rather than a charity case requiring basic banking services. "You've been very consistent with your savings," she observed, scrolling through years of modest deposits and careful withdrawals. "Even through some significant expenditures, you've maintained steady contributions to your emergency fund." Significant expenditures. The clinical term made my sacrifices sound like strategic investments rather than emotional manipulations that had drained my resources while enriching people who'd taken my generosity for granted. "I want to set up automatic transfers," I said, my voice gaining confidence as I spoke. "Every month, I want money moved into accounts that other people can't access. Savings that can't be borrowed against or requested for emergencies that aren't mine to solve." Linda nodded as if this were the most natural request in the world, as if establishing financial boundaries was something responsible adults did routinely, rather than revolutionary acts that required courage I'd been building for decades. We spent an hour restructuring my finances, creating separate accounts for different purposes, establishing automatic transfers that would protect my resources from future exploitation. Each signature felt like signing a declaration of independence, formal documentation that I was choosing self-preservation over endless accommodation. "Is there anything else I can help you with today?" Linda asked as we concluded our business. "Yes," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "I want to apply for a credit card. Something with my name only. No joint accounts, no authorized users, nothing that gives anyone else access to credit I'm responsible for paying." The application process was simpler than I'd expected. My employment history and steady income qualifying me for a card with a reasonable limit, and terms that felt manageable rather than predatory. When Linda handed me the temporary card, it felt like holding a passport to a country I'd never visited, a place where I could make purchases based on my own desires rather than other people's needs. My next stop was somewhere I'd been avoiding for 3 years, Dr. Patricia Wong's office, where I'd canceled and rescheduled appointments because family emergencies always seemed to coincide with my healthcare needs. The receptionist greeted me with the warmth of someone who remembered patients even when they'd been absent for extended periods. "Mrs. Chen, we haven't seen you in so long. How are you feeling?" "Like someone who's been neglecting herself," I replied honestly. "I'd like to schedule a complete physical, and I want to discuss some symptoms I've been ignoring." The honesty felt revolutionary. For years, I'd minimized my health concerns, convincing myself that minor aches and persistent fatigue were normal parts of aging that didn't justify medical attention or the expense of comprehensive care. Admitting that I'd been ignoring my body's signals felt like acknowledging that I'd been treating myself with the same disregard other people had shown me. Dr. Wong scheduled me for a full examination the following week, along with diagnostic tests I'd been postponing and specialist consultations I'd convinced myself I couldn't afford. As I left with a folder full of appointment cards and preparation instructions, I realized I was investing in my future for the first time in decades. The afternoon brought the most difficult task: cleaning house, literally and metaphorically. I returned to my apartment and began sorting through possessions that told the story of a life I was ready to edit. The closet yielded clothes I'd kept because they were gifts from family members, items that made me feel frumpy and invisible, but that I'd worn out of obligation rather than choice. I folded them carefully and placed them in bags destined for donation, keeping only pieces that made me feel comfortable and confident. The living room bookshelves held volumes on topics that had never interested me, but that I'd acquired because someone had suggested they would make me more interesting to talk to. Self-help books about pleasing difficult people, cookbooks for entertaining large groups I was never invited to join, financial guides for maximizing resources I was expected to share rather than protect. Those books joined the clothing and donation bags, making room for novels I'd always wanted to read, biographies of women who'd found strength in later life, travel guides for places I'd dreamed of visiting but had never prioritized over other people's needs. The most challenging task was sorting through photographs, decades of images that documented family events where I'd been present but not essential, celebrations where I'd provided support but received little recognition. I kept pictures that brought me joy, candid shots of Tommy and Emma from their early years, Photos of Elliot as a child when our relationship had been uncomplicated by outside influences, images that reminded me of love that had been genuine rather than conditional. The formal family portraits where I appeared uncomfortable and peripheral went into a box marked for storage. Not thrown away. I wasn't ready for that level of finality, but removed from daily view, relegated to memory rather than constant reminder of my diminished status in my own family's narrative. As evening approached, I realized I hadn't checked my phone in hours, hadn't wondered if anyone needed anything from me, hadn't felt the familiar anxiety about being available for emergencies that might require my intervention. The silence from my family, which had felt devastating just days earlier, now felt like space I could fill with my own choices rather than obligations I was required to fulfill. I ordered dinner from a restaurant I'd always wanted to try, but had considered too expensive for someone who needed to save money for other people's priorities. The Thai food arrived in containers that smelled like adventure. Flavors I'd never explored because I'd trained myself to prefer familiar, economical meals that stretched across multiple dinners. Eating pad thai while sitting in my cleaned and reorganized living room, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Contentment that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or gratitude. The food was delicious, the apartment was peaceful, and the evening belonged entirely to me. At 9:30 p.m., my phone rang. Elliot's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, my old instincts kicked in. The immediate anxiety about what might be wrong, what crisis might require my immediate attention, what sacrifice might be needed to solve a problem I hadn't created. But instead of answering with the breathless urgency of someone always expecting emergencies, I let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. Then I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I declined the call. The phone fell silent, then chimed with a voicemail notification. I stared at the icon for several minutes, recognizing that listening to the message would either pull me back into the cycle of availability and obligation I was trying to escape, or confirm that my new boundaries were necessary for my survival. I pressed play. "Mom, hey, it's me. Listen, I know last night was difficult, but we need to talk. Meadow thinks maybe we were too hasty about the babysitting situation. Emma's been asking for you, and Tommy seems upset about something he won't explain. Could you call me back? We might be able to work something out." Work something out. The phrase implied negotiation between equals, but the tone suggested desperation from people who'd discovered that replacing me wasn't as simple as they'd expected. Professional childcare was expensive, and quality nannies apparently had standards and requirements that went beyond unconditional availability and willingness to work for free. 6 months ago, this call would have sent me rushing back to their house with gratitude and relief, eager to restore my role in their lives regardless of the conditions they imposed. Now, it felt like confirmation that my worth to them had always been measured in services I provided rather than love I offered. I deleted the voicemail without returning the call. Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine, a bottle I'd been saving for a special occasion that had never arrived, and opened one of the novels I'd rescued from my donation pile. The story was about a woman discovering her own strength after decades of putting everyone else first, and I read until midnight, completely absorbed in a narrative that felt like it had been written specifically for someone learning to value herself. That night, I slept better than I had in months. No anxiety about morning phone calls that might bring requests I felt obligated to fulfill. No guilt about money I'd spent on myself instead of saving for other people's emergencies. No wondering whether I'd done enough to earn the love of people who seemed determined to measure my worth in terms of what I could provide rather than who I was. For the first time in decades, I fell asleep without worrying about anyone else's needs. The freedom felt so profound it was almost frightening, like learning to breathe in a way I'd forgotten was possible. Sunday morning, I woke up and made a list, not of tasks I needed to complete for other people, but of things I wanted to do for myself. Small items mostly, but revolutionary in their focus on my preferences rather than my obligations. Visit the art museum I'd always meant to explore. Buy plants for the apartment that would make it feel more alive. Research community college classes I might enjoy taking. Schedule the dentist appointment I'd been postponing for 2 years. Call my neighbor Helen, who'd invited me for coffee several times when I'd been too busy managing other people's lives to cultivate my own friendships. Each item represented a choice I was making for my own enrichment rather than someone else's benefit. Together, they outlined a life that belonged to me rather than being borrowed by people who'd confused my availability with their entitlement. As I dressed for my day of self-focused activities, the phone rang again. This time, Meadows' name appeared on the screen, and I felt no compulsion to answer. Whatever crisis had prompted her to call someone she'd recently deemed unqualified to watch her children could be resolved without my intervention. I turned off the phone, put it in a drawer, and left my apartment to begin the first day of a life I was choosing for myself, rather than accepting as leftovers from other people's priorities. The woman who'd been discarded like a worn-out appliance was discovering she had more functionality left than anyone had realized, including herself. 3 weeks of silence from my family felt like recovering from a chronic illness I hadn't realized was slowly killing me. Each day without crisis, calls or emergency requests strengthened something inside me that had been weakened by years of being perpetually available for other people's convenience. I was learning to live without the constant low-level anxiety that had become as familiar as breathing. Then the storm arrived. It began on a Tuesday morning when I returned from my new routine. Coffee at the bakery down the street where I'd become friendly with Maria, the owner who remembered my order and asked about my day as if my answer actually mattered. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, humming a song I'd heard on the radio, carrying a small potted orchid I'd bought simply because its purple blooms made me smile. The sight of 3 figures sitting on the floor outside my door stopped me cold. Emma looked up first, her 6-year-old face streaked with tears that appeared genuine rather than manufactured for effect. She wore the pink dress I'd bought her for Easter, now wrinkled and grass-stained as if she'd been playing outside for hours. Tommy sat beside her, his 8-year-old dignity struggling against emotions that made his chin tremble despite his obvious efforts to appear grown up. Between them sat Meadow, but not the polished, controlled woman I'd grown accustomed to seeing. Her usually perfect hair hung limp around her face, her makeup was smudged, and her expensive clothes looked like she'd slept in them. More shocking than her appearance was her expression, desperate in a way that made her look almost human. "Grandma!" Emma launched herself at my legs before I could process what was happening, her small arms wrapping around me with the fierce grip of someone who'd been told she couldn't have something she desperately wanted. "I missed you so much. Mommy said you didn't want to see us anymore." The accusation hit like a physical blow, precisely calibrated to target every guilt trigger Meadow had spent years learning to manipulate. I looked over Emma's head at my daughter-in-law, whose eyes held a combination of calculation and genuine panic that suggested this performance had been carefully planned, but was motivated by real desperation. "Hello, Margaret." Meadow's voice carried none of its usual condescension. "We need to talk." "We're talking now," I replied, my arms automatically circling Emma while my brain worked to understand what crisis had driven them to my doorstep. Tommy approached more cautiously, his hug tentative as if he wasn't sure he'd be welcome. "Inside," Meadow said, standing with difficulty that suggested she'd been sitting on the hard floor longer than comfortable. "Please, it's about Elliot." Those 3 words, "it's about Elliot," bypassed every boundary I'd spent weeks constructing. Whatever had happened to my son, whatever emergency had reduced his wife to this disheveled state, my maternal instincts overrode my newly developed sense of self-preservation. I unlocked my door and led them into my apartment, noting how Meadow's eyes swept across my living space with the automatic assessment I'd grown to recognize. But today, her evaluation seemed different, less dismissive, more calculating, as if she were seeing my modest home as potential refuge rather than evidence of failure. "Sit down," I said, gesturing to my couch while I moved to the kitchen to prepare the tea ritual that had become my default response to stress. "Tell me what's wrong." Emma curled up beside me on the sofa, her head resting against my arm with the natural affection that reminded me why being a grandmother had been the best part of my life. Tommy sat nearby, his attention divided between his phone and the conversation he was clearly old enough to understand, but too young to process completely. Meadow remained standing, pacing my small living room with the restless energy of someone whose usual control had been shattered by circumstances beyond her management. "Elliot lost his job," she said without preamble. "Not laid off. Fired. For embezzlement. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, each one carrying implications that multiplied as I processed their meaning. Embezzlement. Not a budget cut or company downsizing or economic forces beyond his control. Criminal behavior that suggested my son had become someone I didn't recognize. That's not possible, I said automatically, though even as I spoke, I remembered Robert's descent into behaviors that had seemed impossible until they became undeniable. Elliot wouldn't. $23,000, Meadow continued, her voice gaining momentum as if speaking faster might somehow minimize the impact of what she was revealing. Over 8 months. They have documentation, bank records, security footage. He signed a confession to avoid prosecution. $23,000, nearly half my annual income, stolen by someone I'd raised to understand the value of hard work and honest living. I thought about the years I'd worked double shifts to pay his college tuition, the pride I'd felt watching him graduate and build a career that seemed to validate every sacrifice I'd made for his future. Why? The question came out as a whisper, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Because of us. Meadow's voice cracked for the first time since I'd known her, revealing vulnerability that made her seem younger and more frightened than I'd ever seen her. Because I pushed him to maintain a lifestyle we couldn't afford. Because I wanted the house, the cars, the private schools, the appearance of success more than I wanted actual security. This admission, from a woman who'd spent years treating me like an embarrassment to their social aspirations, felt surreal. Meadow acknowledging responsibility for anything felt like a fundamental shift in the natural order, as if gravity had suddenly started working sideways. Where is he now? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Home, drinking. He hasn't left the house in 4 days. Hasn't showered, barely speaks to anyone. Meadow's pacing intensified, her expensive shoes wearing paths in my carpet. He keeps saying he's destroyed everything, that he's turned into his father, that everyone would be better off without him. The comparison to Robert landed like ice in my stomach. I'd spent 38 years wondering if my ex-husband's weaknesses had been genetic, if the self-destructive tendencies that had driven him to abandon his family might resurface in our son. Hearing those fears confirmed felt like watching my worst nightmares manifest in real time. The mortgage company called yesterday, Meadow continued, her voice now barely audible. They want the house. Elliot hasn't made a payment in 3 months. He was using the mortgage money to cover the embezzlement, trying to buy time to figure out how to pay it back before anyone noticed. The financial house of cards was collapsing with the inevitability of structures built on unstable foundations. Everything I'd helped them purchase, every symbol of success I'd contributed to making possible, was about to disappear because my son had chosen theft over honest struggle. What do you want from me? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Meadow stopped pacing and faced me directly, her desperation now completely unconcealed. Help. Financial help. A place to stay until we figure out what comes next. Childcare while I look for work. Real work. Not the freelance design projects I've been pretending constitute a career. The requests felt familiar. Another crisis requiring my resources and sacrifice. But the tone was different. No manipulation, no emotional leverage, no assumption that I owed them assistance. For the first time in our relationship, Meadow was asking rather than demanding, requesting rather than expecting. I can't afford to support a family of 4, I said honestly. My apartment has 1 bedroom. My income covers my basic needs with nothing left over for additional expenses. I know. Meadow's voice carried an acknowledgement of reality that would have been impossible for her to express a month earlier. I know we have no right to ask. I know I've treated you terribly, that I've been awful and ungrateful and— Her voice broke completely, tears flowing with the force of someone who'd been holding them back through sheer willpower. Emma looked up at her mother with concern that suggested this emotional breakdown was not something she'd witnessed before. Tommy's attention shifted from his phone to the adults whose conversation was apparently more serious than he'd initially understood. I was so jealous of you, Meadow whispered, her admission barely audible over her crying. You gave Elliot this unconditional love that I didn't know how to compete with. You had this history with him, these shared experiences, this bond that made me feel like an outsider in my own marriage. So I convinced myself you were the problem, that if I could just minimize your influence, he'd love me the way he loved you. The revelation struck me speechless. All the exclusion, manipulation, and systematic erasure from family events hadn't been about my inadequacy. It had been about Meadows' insecurity. She'd seen my love for Elliot as competition rather than support, my role as his mother as threat rather than resource. I turned him against you because I was afraid he loved you more than me, she continued, the words tumbling out with the desperate honesty of someone who'd run out of alternatives to truth. And now I've destroyed everything, and you're the only person who might be willing to help us, and I don't deserve it. And I know you probably hate me, but I don't know what else to do. The silence that followed felt heavy with accumulated pain, years of misunderstanding and deliberate hurt that had poisoned relationships and damaged trust. Emma's small hand found mine, her 6-year-old instincts recognizing that the adults around her were dealing with problems too big for her to understand, but serious enough to threaten the stability she'd always taken for granted. I don't hate you, I said finally, the words surprising me with their truthfulness. I've been hurt and angry and confused, but I don't hate you. You're the mother of my grandchildren. You're part of my family, even when that family feels broken. Meadows' crying intensified, her shoulders shaking with the kind of sobs that suggested years of suppressed guilt and fear finally finding release. Tommy moved closer to his mother, his 8-year-old instincts telling him to provide comfort, even when he didn't understand the source of her pain. What about Elliot? I asked. What does he say about all this? He doesn't know we're here, Meadow admitted. He's not functioning well enough to make decisions right now. The drinking, the guilt, the shame. It's like watching someone disappear inside themselves. He keeps apologizing for things that happened 30 years ago, talking about his father, saying he's cursed to repeat the same mistakes. The description painted a picture of my son in crisis that activated every protective instinct I'd spent decades developing. Whatever anger I felt about his choices, whatever disappointment I harbored about his recent treatment of me, he was still the little boy I'd raised alone, still the young man I'd sacrificed everything to launch into successful adulthood. I need to see him, I said, the decision forming as I spoke. Before I can even think about how to help, I need to understand what we're really dealing with. Meadow nodded with the grateful relief of someone who'd expected rejection and received consideration instead. He's not the son you remember right now. The drinking has changed him, made him mean and paranoid, and I've seen what alcohol can do to good men, I interrupted, memories of Robert's transformation providing context I'd hoped never to need again. I know what I might be walking into. An hour later, I found myself in the passenger seat of Meadows' SUV, driving toward the house I'd helped them buy, preparing to confront the wreckage of dreams I'd invested my own security to make possible. Emma and Tommy sat in the back seat, their excited chatter about seeing Daddy mixed with undertones of worry that suggested they understood more about their family's crisis than their parents realized. The house looked different in the afternoon light. Smaller somehow, its perfect exterior unable to conceal the chaos that had consumed the lives within. Meadows' garden showed signs of neglect, the careful arrangements I'd admired now overgrown and weedy. Even from the driveway, I could see curtains drawn against daylight, windows that should have welcomed sunshine sealed against the world outside. Let me go in first, Meadows said as we approached the front door. Let me prepare him. He's fragile right now. But before she could turn her key in the lock, the door opened to reveal my son, and for a moment, I didn't recognize him. Elliot had lost weight, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that seemed to have collapsed inward. His hair was unwashed, his face unshaven, his eyes red-rimmed and unfocused in ways that reminded me too powerfully of his father during the worst days before Robert's departure. He held a glass of what was obviously not water, and the smell of alcohol reached me from across the threshold. Mom? His voice carried surprise mixed with something that might have been shame. What are you doing here? Coming to see my son, I replied, stepping past Meadow with the authority of someone who'd earned the right to enter this house through years of financial and emotional investment. We need to talk. What followed was the conversation that would either restore my family or destroy what remained of it forever. The living room that had once showcased Meadows' decorating skills now resembled a crime scene where Hope had been murdered by desperation. Empty bottles clustered on surfaces like glass monuments to poor decisions. Newspapers lay scattered across coffee tables, their headlines about economic recovery mocking the financial devastation that had consumed this household. The smell of stale alcohol and unwashed clothes created an atmosphere of defeat that seemed to seep into the walls themselves. Elliot collapsed onto the couch with the boneless surrender of someone whose spine had been removed along with his dignity. Up close, the resemblance to his father during those final months before abandonment was so strong it made my chest tight with recognition and dread. The same hollow eyes, the same defensive posture, the same way of holding alcohol like a shield against conversations he didn't want to have. "So now you know," he said, his words slightly slurred, but his tone sharp with the particular cruelty that alcohol seemed to unlock in men who disappointed themselves beyond recovery. "Your perfect son is a thief, a fraud, a failure, who couldn't even steal money competently." The self-loathing in his voice was so thick I could taste it in the air between us. This was familiar territory. I'd navigated these emotional landscapes with Robert, learned to recognize the difference between genuine remorse and the performative guilt that alcoholics use to deflect responsibility while maintaining their victimhood. "Tell me what happened," I said, settling into the chair across from him with the careful distance of someone who'd learned that proximity to destructive behavior could be dangerous. Not the facts Meadow already shared. "Tell me how you decided that stealing was an acceptable solution to whatever problems you were facing." Elliot laughed, but the sound contained no humor, only the bitter recognition of someone who'd been caught in lies he'd been telling himself. "Acceptable? Nothing about this was acceptable. It was supposed to be temporary. Borrow against future commissions, replace it before anyone noticed, keep everything stable until the next big sale came through." "For 8 months?" I asked. "You convinced yourself this was temporary for 8 months?" "Time moves differently when you're desperate," he replied, taking another drink with the mechanical precision of someone for whom alcohol had become medicine rather than pleasure. When Meadow started talking about Emma's private school applications, when Tommy needed equipment for travel baseball, when the mortgage company started calling about missed payments, I didn't know we'd been missing because Meadow was juggling bills I thought were getting paid. He was building a narrative where circumstances had conspired against him, where external pressures had forced his hand, where everyone except him bore responsibility for choices only he could have made. It was the same story Robert had told about his drinking, always caused by work stress or family demands or economic forces beyond his control, never the result of character flaws or poor decisions that could have been avoided. "Stop," I said, my voice carrying authority that surprised both of us. "Stop making excuses and tell me the truth." The directness seemed to penetrate his alcoholic fog in a way that sympathy or understanding never could have. He looked at me with something approaching alertness, as if he'd forgotten I was capable of challenging him rather than simply absorbing whatever emotional damage he needed to inflict. "The truth?" He set down his glass with deliberate care, his hands shaking slightly from either alcohol withdrawal or the effort of maintaining honesty. "The truth is that I wanted things I couldn't afford. I wanted to be the kind of man who could give his family everything they asked for without thinking about the cost. I wanted to prove that I was better than my father, more successful, more capable of providing security." This admission felt closer to reality than anything he'd said since I'd arrived. The desire to transcend his father's failures, to prove himself worthy of the sacrifices I'd made to launch his adult life, to justify the faith I'd placed in his potential. These motivations made psychological sense even if they didn't excuse the choices he'd made. "So you stole," I said simply. "So I stole." The repetition sounded like a confession in a courtroom, formal acknowledgement of guilt that couldn't be rationalized or minimized. $23,000 from clients who trusted me with their retirement accounts. People who worked their entire lives to save money I took because I was too proud to tell my wife we couldn't afford the lifestyle she wanted. "And now?" I asked. "What happens now?" Elliot's laugh returned, bitter and self-destructive. "Now I drink until I'm numb enough to sleep. Tomorrow I drink until I'm numb enough to wake up. Eventually, maybe I disappear like my father did, Except I'll have the courtesy to make it permanent so I don't leave anyone wondering when I might come back to destroy their lives again. The casual reference to suicide hit me like cold water, shocking in its matter-of-fact delivery. This wasn't a cry for help or a manipulation tactic. It was the logical conclusion of someone who'd run out of reasons to continue living with consequences he'd created but couldn't bear to face. "Look at me," I said, my voice carrying the same no-nonsense tone I'd used when he was 8 years old and testing boundaries that weren't negotiable. "Look at me right now." His eyes met mine with reluctant attention, alcohol glazed but still capable of recognizing authority when it was presented clearly. "You are not your father," I said, each word deliberate and weighted. "Your father ran away because he was weak and selfish and couldn't handle responsibility. You're sitting here facing the consequences of your actions instead of disappearing. That's already more courage than he ever showed." "Courage?" Elliot's voice cracked with something between laughter and sobbing. "I destroyed my career, my family's security, my children's future. I became exactly what I swore I'd never become." "You made terrible choices," I agreed, refusing to soften the truth with false comfort. "You betrayed people's trust, violated your professional ethics, and prioritized appearance over integrity. Those are facts we can't change." He flinched as if I'd struck him, but he didn't look away. Something in his expression suggested he'd been expecting judgment, and finding its honest delivery almost refreshing after weeks of either avoiding consequences or wallowing in self-pity. "But here's what else is true," I continued. "You confessed instead of continuing to lie. You're facing prosecution instead of running away. You're still here, still trying to figure out how to repair the damage, still caring about the people you've hurt. That's not who your father was when he left us." The comparison seemed to penetrate his defensive armor in ways that sympathy hadn't been able to reach. For the first time since I'd arrived, Elliot looked like he was processing information rather than simply enduring a conversation he wanted to escape. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, and the question sounded genuine rather than rhetorical. "Get sober," I said without hesitation. "Today. Right now. Pour out every bottle in this house and don't drink again until you've figured out who you are when alcohol isn't making your decisions for you." "I can't," he began, but I interrupted before he could complete the excuse. "You can, and you will, because the alternative is losing your children along with everything else. Emma and Tommy are watching their father disappear into a bottle the same way you watched yours disappear. Do you want them to spend their adult lives wondering if they'll inherit your weakness, the same way you've spent yours wondering about Robert's?" The reference to his children seemed to cut through his self-absorption more effectively than any appeal to his own well-being could have. He looked toward the kitchen where I could hear Emma and Tommy talking quietly with their mother, their voices carrying the subdued quality that children develop when they're trying to be invisible during adult crises. "They deserve better than this," he said quietly. "They deserve the father you're capable of being when you're not drunk," I replied. "But that man has to choose to show up. No one can force you to get sober, and no one can make you face your problems honestly. Those are decisions only you can make." Elliot stood up slowly, walking to the window that looked out onto the backyard where Tommy's baseball equipment lay scattered across grass that hadn't been mowed in weeks. His shoulders shook with either withdrawal tremors or suppressed emotion, possibly both. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "One decision at a time," I said, borrowing wisdom from Al-Anon meetings I'd attended during Robert's worst period, back when I'd still believed that loving someone enough could save them from themselves. "You can't fix everything today, but you can choose not to drink today. Tomorrow, you can make the same choice again." He turned from the window to face me, and for a moment, I saw the little boy who'd cried for 3 days when his father left, the teenager who'd worked part-time jobs to help with household expenses, the young man who'd graduated college with honors, because he'd understood that education was his ticket to a better life than the one he'd inherited. "Will you help us?" he asked, and the question carried none of the entitlement that had characterized previous requests for assistance. This was someone asking for help rather than demanding it, recognizing that support was a gift rather than an obligation. "I'll help you get sober," I said carefully. I'll help you figure out how to rebuild your life in ways that don't depend on other people's money or approval. I'll help you learn to be the kind of man your children can respect and your wife can trust. I paused, letting the weight of my next words settle between us before I continued. But I won't enable your self-destruction, and I won't sacrifice my financial security to fund a lifestyle you can't afford. I won't lie to your children about why Daddy doesn't live here anymore if you choose alcohol over recovery. And I won't pretend that love is enough to save someone who doesn't want to be saved. The boundaries felt foreign in my mouth. Clear, firm statements about what I would and wouldn't do to help. For 38 years, I'd operated under the assumption that unconditional love meant unconditional support. That being a good mother required saying yes to every request and absorbing every crisis without complaint. Now I understood that real love sometimes required saying no. That genuine support meant refusing to enable destructive behavior. That the most helpful thing I could do might be to let natural consequences teach lessons that my intervention would only postpone. I understand, Elliot said, and something in his tone suggested he actually did. I think I need help, professional help. Not just someone to pay my bills or watch my kids while I figure things out. Real help with the drinking and the... He gestured vaguely at himself. Whatever this has turned me into. There are programs, I said. Inpatient treatment facilities, outpatient counseling, support groups for people dealing with addiction and financial crimes. But you have to want recovery more than you want to escape from your problems. And if I do that, if I get sober, get help, try to rebuild everything I destroyed, will you be part of our lives again? Will you forgive me for how we've treated you? The question hung in the air between us, weighted with years of accumulated hurt and the possibility of genuine reconciliation. Looking at my son, broken, desperate, but finally honest about his circumstances, I felt something shift in my chest. Not the automatic forgiveness that had characterized my previous responses to family crises, but something more complex and conditional. I'll be part of your recovery, I said slowly. I'll support your efforts to become the man you're capable of being. But the relationship we have going forward will depend on the choices you make from this moment on. I can't trust you until you prove you're trustworthy. I can't invest in your future until you demonstrate that you've learned from your mistakes. He nodded, as if he'd expected nothing more generous and possibly nothing more honest. Where do I start? He asked. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through contacts until I found the number I'd saved but never used. A treatment center that specialized in addiction and financial crimes, recommended by a support group I'd attended briefly during Robert's decline. You start by making this phone call, I said, showing him the number. Today, right now, while you still have enough clarity to admit you need help. As Elliot reached for the phone with hands that shook but moved with determination, I realized this moment represented something I'd never experienced before. The possibility that love combined with boundaries might actually be more powerful than love combined with endless accommodation. For the first time in decades, I was choosing to help someone in a way that didn't require sacrificing myself, and somehow, that felt like the most loving thing I'd ever done. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen on a Saturday morning, preparing breakfast for one, a luxury I'd learned to appreciate rather than endure. The apartment felt different now. Not because anything had changed physically, but because I'd stopped seeing it through other people's judgmental eyes and started experiencing it as the home I'd created for myself. Sunlight streamed through windows I'd cleaned the day before, casting warm patterns across surfaces that no longer apologized for their modest origins. The mismatched dishes had become eclectic rather than embarrassing. The second-hand furniture told stories of careful choices rather than financial limitations. Every object in my space had been selected for my comfort, arranged for my pleasure, maintained according to my standards rather than someone else's expectations. The phone rang at 8:30 a.m., a call I now answered by choice rather than compulsion. Hi, Mom. Elliot's voice carried a clarity I hadn't heard in years, possibly decades. Are you still planning to come to family dinner tomorrow? Family dinner. The phrase meant something entirely different now than it had 6 months ago when I'd prepared elaborate meals for people who couldn't be bothered to show up. Now it represented a weekly gathering at Meadow's sister's house, where everyone contributed something and no one person was expected to provide everything. "I'll be there," I confirmed, checking my calendar not because I'd forgotten, but because I now kept track of my own schedule instead of simply being available whenever others needed me. "Should I bring the salad or dessert?" "Dessert, if you don't mind. Emma specifically requested your chocolate cake." The request made me smile, not because my granddaughter wanted something I could provide, but because the asking had become genuine rather than obligatory. Emma's affection for my baking came from happy memories we'd created together, not from her parents' need for free catering services. "Tell her it's a deal," I said. "How are you feeling today?" This question, simple on its surface, carried weight that both of us understood. Elliot had been sober for 5 months and 22 days. A count he marked with the precision of someone who'd learned that recovery was measured in small victories rather than grand gestures. Some days were harder than others, but each one represented a choice to face reality rather than escape from it. "Good," he said, and I believed him. Nervous about the interview tomorrow, but good nervous. Like I'm finally doing something that matters instead of just trying to survive until evening. The interview was for a position with a nonprofit organization that helped people recovering from financial crimes rebuild their lives and careers. The salary would be significantly less than what he'd earned in his previous position, but the work aligned with values he was rediscovering rather than compromising. "You'll do fine," I said, meaning it. "You have insights now that you couldn't have gained any other way. That's valuable to people who need to understand that recovery is possible." After we hung up, I continued my morning routine, coffee at my own pace, reading news that interested me rather than searching for topics that might make me seem informed during conversations with people who weren't listening anyway, planning my day around activities I'd chosen for my own enrichment. At 10 a.m., I walked to the community center where I'd been volunteering for 3 months, teaching basic financial literacy to women over 50 who were rebuilding their lives after divorce, widowhood, or other major transitions. The work felt meaningful in ways that transcended the simple satisfaction of helping others. It connected me to women who'd discovered, as I had, that starting over was possible at any age. "Margaret!" Helen Rodriguez greeted me with the warmth of someone who'd become a genuine friend rather than just a neighbor I occasionally chatted with in the hallway. "Ready for today's group?" Helen had been the first person I'd called when I decided to stop waiting for my family to include me in their lives and start building relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligated tolerance. Our coffee dates had evolved into a friendship that felt natural rather than necessary, built on shared interests rather than shared crises. "More than ready," I replied, settling into the classroom where 8 women were arranged around tables, their notebooks open and their attention focused on learning skills they'd never thought they'd need. Today we're talking about setting financial boundaries with adult children. The irony wasn't lost on me, teaching lessons I'd learned through painful experience to women who were facing similar challenges. But the irony felt empowering rather than bitter, evidence that even the most difficult experiences could be transformed into wisdom that served others. "My daughter keeps asking for money for her children's activities," said Patricia, a 63-year-old woman whose husband had left her financially devastated after 40 years of marriage. "I want to help my grandchildren, but I can barely cover my own expenses." "The guilt is terrible," added Susan, a recent widow struggling to understand finances her husband had always managed. "How do you say no to family without feeling like you're being selfish?" These questions echoed conversations I'd had with myself for years, internal debates between love and self-preservation that had always resolved in favor of everyone except myself. Now I had answers based on experience rather than theory, boundaries that had been tested and proven effective. Helping family and enabling family are 2 different things, I explained, sharing wisdom that had cost me thousands of dollars and decades of self-doubt to acquire. Real help builds independence. Enabling creates dependence. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to solve problems that other people need to learn to solve themselves. The discussion that followed felt like group therapy disguised as financial education. Women shared stories of exploitation disguised as emergency requests, manipulation wrapped in family obligation, guilt used as currency to purchase services that should have been freely offered rather than demanded. But how do you know when you're being taken advantage of? Asked Maria, whose son had been borrowing money for car repairs that somehow never improved his transportation situation. When the giving is all one way, I replied, thinking of years when I'd provided support without receiving recognition, solved problems without being thanked, given love without having it returned in any meaningful form. When your value to someone else is measured entirely by what you can provide, rather than who you are. As the class ended and women gathered their materials, several lingered to share personal stories that felt like confessions. Years of financial abuse by family members who'd learned to weaponize love, relationships where emotional manipulation had been normalized to the point of invisibility. "You give me hope," Patricia said as she prepared to leave. "Seeing that you could change these patterns in your 70s makes me think maybe it's not too late for me either." "It's never too late to start valuing yourself," I replied, words that would have seemed impossible to believe when I was sitting alone at a dinner table set for 8, waiting for family members who'd forgotten I existed. The afternoon brought another new routine. Lunch with neighbors who'd become friends, women who shared stories and recipes and recommendations for books or movies, without expecting me to solve their problems or fund their dreams. The conversation flowed naturally, punctuated by laughter that felt genuine rather than obligatory. "How are the grandchildren?" asked Carol, a retired teacher whose grandchildren lived across the country and visited twice a year with carefully planned itineraries that maximized quality time. "Wonderful," I said and meant it. "Emma's learning piano and Tommy made the honor roll. I see them every Sunday for family dinner, and sometimes Emma calls just to chat about her day." The difference between these interactions and my previous relationship with the children was profound. Now our time together was treasured rather than taken for granted, planned rather than assumed, built on mutual affection rather than obligated availability. "And Elliot?" Carol asked with the careful concern of someone who'd witnessed my family's crisis and recovery. 5 months sober?" I said with pride that no longer felt complicated by resentment or fear. "He's rebuilding everything. His career, his relationships, his sense of himself. It's slow work, but it's honest work." That evening, as I prepared dinner for myself in my quiet kitchen, I reflected on the transformation that had brought me to this moment. 6 months ago, I'd been a woman whose worth was measured entirely by her willingness to sacrifice herself for other people's convenience. I'd lived in constant anxiety about the next crisis that might require my intervention, the next emergency that might drain my resources, the next family gathering I might be excluded from, despite my contributions to making it possible. Now, I was someone who said yes when it aligned with my values and no when it didn't. Someone who gave from abundance rather than desperation, who helped others without depleting herself, who loved family without surrendering her identity to their needs. The journey hadn't been easy. Learning to set boundaries after decades of having none felt like learning a foreign language in my 70s. Discovering self-worth that didn't depend on other people's approval required unlearning patterns that had seemed essential to survival. Building relationships based on mutual respect rather than emotional obligation meant starting over with family members who'd grown accustomed to taking my love for granted. But the reward was immeasurable. Peace that didn't depend on other people's moods, security that couldn't be threatened by other people's crises, relationships built on genuine affection rather than manufactured guilt. At 7 p.m., my phone rang again. This time, it was Emma. "Grandma, guess what happened at school today?" Her 6-year-old voice bubbled with excitement about a story that would probably involve playground drama and someone's birthday party, and whatever fascinating detail had captured her attention during lunch. I settled into my comfortable chair, put my feet up, and prepared to give her my complete attention, not because I was obligated to be available for every call, but because I genuinely wanted to hear about her day. "Tell me everything," I said, and for the next 20 minutes I listened to enthusiastic descriptions of art projects and friend dramas, and the injustice of homework assignments that interfered with more important activities like playing with dolls. When Emma finished her stories, she said something that made my heart stop. "I love you, Grandma. You always listen to me like what I'm saying is important." "Because it is important," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. "And I love you too, sweetheart. More than you'll ever know." After she hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my living room, surrounded by the peaceful silence of a home that belonged entirely to me, filled with furniture I'd chosen for my comfort, and pictures that brought me joy rather than pain. I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months ago, desperate for approval, willing to accept crumbs of affection, measuring her worth by her usefulness to other people. That woman had been so afraid of being alone that she'd allowed herself to be treated as invisible by the very people she'd sacrificed everything to serve. Now, I understood the difference between being alone and being lonely. Loneliness had been sitting at a table set for 8, waiting for people who'd forgotten I existed. Being alone was choosing to spend Saturday evening reading a book I'd selected because it interested me, drinking tea from my favorite cup, planning tomorrow's activities based on my preferences rather than other people's expectations. I'd spent 40 years giving everything to everyone, believing that love required complete self-sacrifice, that being a good mother and grandmother meant erasing myself to make room for other people's needs and dreams. Now I knew that the most valuable gift I could give my family was a grandmother who valued herself enough to expect reciprocal respect, who loved them enough to refuse to enable their worst impulses, who was strong enough to say no when necessary, and yes, when it truly mattered. The phone calls asking for emergency money had stopped. The assumptions about my endless availability had ended. The treatment of my home as insufficient for their social standards had ceased. In their place, I'd gained something infinitely more precious. Relationships built on genuine affection rather than guilt. Conversations that included my thoughts rather than just my services. A family that valued my presence rather than just my presence. As I prepared for bed, I looked in the bathroom mirror and saw a woman I barely recognized. Not because I looked different, but because I finally looked like myself. The face staring back at me belonged to someone who'd stopped apologizing for existing, stopped diminishing herself to make others comfortable, stopped believing that love required the complete erasure of self. Tomorrow, I would teach women how to value themselves. Tomorrow, I would bake a cake for a granddaughter who genuinely wanted it rather than feeling entitled to it. Tomorrow, I would attend a family dinner where my contributions were appreciated rather than expected. But tonight, I would fall asleep in my own bed, in my own home, surrounded by my own choices, secure in the knowledge that I'd finally learned the most important lesson of my life. You cannot love others well until you love yourself enough to demand the respect you deserve. They had tried to erase me. Instead, they had taught me to find myself, and the woman I'd discovered was stronger, wiser, and more valuable than I'd ever dared to imagine. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Have you ever wondered if your love was being taken for granted by the people who should treasure it most? If this story touched your heart, please share it in the comments below. And if you believe that we all deserve respect and recognition regardless of our age, hit that like button and subscribe. Because everyone needs to hear that it's never too late to start valuing yourself the way you deserve to be valued.